The Chamber of Perpetual Echoes was not built. It was cultivated, a cathedral of living crystal that pulsed with the slow, resonant energy of the ethel concordance, its ceiling an incomprehensible lattice that captured the faint stellar light of a distant, unnamed sector, filtering it down in shifting, cold emerald rays that did little to alleviate the pervasive, deep atmosphere of historical gravity. The air itself was thick, not with vapor, but with the accumulated weight of 20,000 cycles of governance, of wars narrowly averted, and of treaties meticulously ratified across 100 worlds. Within this crystalline heart, the High Council of Preservation was assembled, their forms, tall, slender, and covered in robes woven from starlight fiber, motionless upon the tiered, organically grown plinths that circled the central discourse node. The silence was not empty. It was a profound, anticipatory void, broken only by the nearly imperceptible harmonic hum of the chamber's core archives, which catalogued every moment since the Great Schism. The matter before them was an anomaly of the deepest temporal order, a resurgence of the forgotten in a place that should have remained fallow, a world designated Sol 3, the quarantined sphere of the Vesper incident, a world they had last touched 20 millennia ago when the long sleepers first activated their beacon protocols and drifted into the great cosmic night. Counselor Kryes, his facial cilia twitching with a delicate blend of apprehension and weary responsibility, initiated the formal address, his voice a low, precisely modulated baritone that carried easily through the vast space, devoid of echo. He spoke not to the assembled council, but to the collective consciousness of ethel history, a solemn appeal to their fundamental law. The Sensorium's long-range deep-time probe has returned its analysis, designated Provisional File 7 Gamma 9. The projections are now beyond the threshold of statistical error. Sol 3, the former Vesper reclamation zone, possesses a native, non-ethel civilization at a stage of development previously assessed as impossible for a quarantine primal classification. The indigenous life form, which the deep-time nomenclature systems label Terran, has attained systemic energy utilization that registers marginally within the lower bounds of a Tier 4 sub-designation. They possess localized FDL-equivalent kinetic technologies, a sophisticated orbital infrastructure that dwarfs our initial estimates, and most critically, they are actively and coherently modulating the energy output patterns emanating from the very region where the historical archives place the remnants of the Vesper and the designated loss field of the critical supplies. Kryes paused, allowing the weight of the pronouncement to settle upon the council. To the ethel, 20,000 years was a span of deep maintenance, of meticulous record-keeping, a period in which slow cultural evolution was measured in millennia, not cycles. The sudden, chaotic, and unprecedented rise of a species from a primal state to near Tier 4 was an affront to the predictable order of galactic evolution, a statistical impossibility that frayed the edges of their collective calm. Marshal Xylan, the imposing figure who directed the Concordance's defense and interdiction assets, a being whose entire existence was predicated upon the application of controlled, overwhelming force, responded with a measured, metallic hiss of disbelief that was amplified by his ceremonial carapace. Impossible. The Vesper incident protocols were absolute. The planet was cleansed of advanced technology, seeded with only basic, survival-level genetic markers, and subjected to a deep space gravity lock that should have stabilized its axial tilt for at least 50 millennia. A Tier 4 emergence, particularly one displaying coherent control over a designated ethel artifact retrieval zone, suggests a catastrophic failure in the quarantine mechanisms, or, far worse, the undetected interference of a rival ancient polity. The Vesper is not merely a lost hull. It contains the primary chronographic cores, the true keys to the Third Age. The critical supplies, the catalyst of unmaking, must be recovered before its latent volatility is triggered by this unsanctioned, chaotic presence. We cannot negotiate with chaos. I propose the immediate deployment of the Deep Penetration Fleet, a surgical, overwhelming force designed to secure the perimeter, neutralize all orbital defense platforms, and initiate the retrieval before the Terrans even comprehend the nature of the energy they are disturbing. Xylan's proposal was the logical outcome of a mind trained in crisis mitigation, a preference for the clean, finite solution of force over the unpredictable mess of diplomacy. A third voice entered the discourse, one that seemed to emanate not from a single being, but from the deep memory of the chamber itself. Archivist Sir Vorel, whose funk. Tian was to interpret the long-wave echoes of time, moved its ancient, layered form slightly, and the crystal plinth beneath him pulsed a deep, resonant crimson. The Marshal speaks of chaos, but he proposes violence, which is the progenitor of deeper chaos. He speaks of the Vesper's chronographic cores, yet he disregards the foundational truth of its loss. The Vesper did not suffer an accident. It enacted the final stages of the precursor protocol, a failsafe maneuver intended to preserve the catalyst of unmaking from the encroaching rot of the Second Age. The historical files are clear, though shrouded in ritualistic language. The Terrans, the emergent sentients, are not merely disturbing the supply cache. The analysis of provisional file 7 Gamma 9 indicates they are containing it. The energy modulation observed is not an attempt to harness the catalyst's output, but a sophisticated, sustained dampening field, operating on principles we ourselves abandoned 4 millennia ago due to their esoteric energy demands. They have not stumbled upon our past. They appear to be conscientiously managing a volatile element of our past, and they have done so for an unknown duration. Vorel's observation introduced a layer of complexity that paralyzed the typical ethel response algorithm. The notion that a species they had categorized as primal could not only discern the nature of the catalyst, but also implement a containment solution superior to their own current operational standards, was philosophically staggering, an insult to the assumed hierarchy of intelligence. Counselor Kryze seized the moment of stunned silence, projecting his own deeply held conviction into the crystalline air. The Seer-Archivist has illuminated the ethical precipice upon which we stand. If the Terrans are indeed acting as unintentional custodians of our lost heritage, their immediate, violent subjugation transforms us from seekers of historical truth into opportunistic aggressors. Our laws of contact forbid such action without undeniable provocation. Furthermore, the analysis of their orbital infrastructure, while lacking the interstellar reach of a Tier 5 polity, shows an astonishing depth of localized technological integration, a silent, pervasive network that is not designed for aggression, but for absolute defense and the maintenance of their internal equilibrium. They do not project power into the void. They absorb it, manage it, and stabilize their sphere with a quiet, efficient mastery. They are an unknown variable, perhaps the most profound we have encountered in the current epoch. Therefore, the deployment of the Deep Penetration Fleet is reckless. I advocate for the immediate activation of the primary diplomatic relay, a single unarmed vessel, the Sojourner's Beacon, to enter the Sol system under a banner of absolute, unreserved non-aggression, accompanied by a full historical manifest. We must speak to them first, not conquer them. We must ascertain the nature of their ethical framework, their comprehension of the catalyst, and the source of their unexpected technological and philosophical trajectory. The debate raged for 3 full cycles of the chamber's internal clock. The Ethel's foundational political structure required consensus, and the conflict between Xylan's imperative of security and Kryze's imperative of ethical preservation threatened to deadlock the recovery mission entirely. Every word was a calculated thrust, a philosophical excavation into the nature of property rights across millennia, the responsibility of the technologically advanced, and the unpredictable vector of evolution. Xylan's arguments were pragmatic and stark. Possession is 9/10 of historical right. The catalyst is too dangerous to remain in the custody of an unknown, potentially volatile species. The risk of interspecies conflict is mitigated by the speed of a decisive, preemptive strike. Kryze countered with an argument rooted in Ethel's deepest self-image. True power lies not in the capacity to destroy, but in the restraint exercised when destruction is the easiest path. A civilization that quietly contains a weapon of mass destruction for 20,000 years deserves the respect of cautious inquiry, not the terror of an invading fleet. The archivist Seer Vorel remained the fulcrum, continually feeding contextual data on the nature of the Vesper's mission, which was historically shrouded in deliberate ambiguity, reinforcing the idea that the ancient Ethel may have intended for the catalyst to be found and managed by an emerging species, a kind of deep-time, cosmic test of stewardship. In the end, the compromise was reached, a delicate, fragile political maneuver that satisfied the honor and fear of both factions. A massive, veiled recovery fleet, consisting of heavy cruisers and logistical arrays, Xylan's compromise for security, would pause at the very edge of the Sol system's Uit cloud, cloaked and silent, their weapons systems powered D. Owned but ready for immediate activation. Simultaneously, the Sojourner's Beacon, an unarmed diplomatic frigate, would proceed to the inner system, carrying Counselor Kryze as the emissary of the Concordance. This was a political statement of immense risk. Kryze, a central figure in Ethel governance, would be exposing himself to an unknown, while Xylan's fleet would serve as a silent, powerful, yet politically restrained guarantee of the Concordance's ultimate intent to recover its lost property. The final decree was issued. The mission was one of retrieval by diplomacy, secured by the silent vigil of the fleet. As the crystalline chamber's light shifted from emerald to a cold, neutral sapphire, the Ethel Concordance launched its first open contact mission in 12 centuries. Its target the blue and white marble of Sol 3, a planet of forgotten memory now demanding an answer. The journey through the void toward the Sol system was an exercise in cinematic tension, the Sojourner's beacon gliding silently ahead of the colossal, black geometry of the cloaked Vigil fleet. Counselor Kryze spent the transit cycle in the vessel's observation dome, a vast curve of reinforced, non-reflective viewport that offered an unfiltered view of the emerging stellar panorama. His internal monologue was a quiet storm of philosophical reckoning. He pondered the nature of time itself, how a species could condense the expected trajectory of 50 millennia into a mere 200 cycles, a burst of exponential cognitive advancement that defied all known galactic models. He projected the most likely Terran responses, mapping them against the established protocols for Tier 4 polities. Initial fear, followed by aggressive posturing, an attempt to leverage a perceived technological imbalance, or perhaps a panicked, desperate offering of tribute. All scenarios ended in either prolonged, frustrating negotiation or a swift, regrettable military engagement. Yet, the persistent data regarding the Terran containment field around the catalyst of unmaking, a technology requiring immense, sustained ethical commitment, nagged at him, introducing a confounding factor that broke all his established models. They do not act like an emergent power. He felt the profound, psychological weight of Marshal Xylan's silent presence at the edge of the system, a threat held barely in check by a diplomatic tether that was thin and brittle. Upon breaching the Uit cloud and decelerating into the inner system, the sheer scale of the Terran presence became undeniable, not through a display of obvious military might, but through the overwhelming density of their orbital infrastructure. The asteroid belt was not a hazard. It was a harnessed resource, laced with sensor webs and automated processing platforms that spoke of unimaginable industrial capacity. Mars was crowned with a fledgling atmospheric envelope, a project of deep-time terraforming that suggested a species planning not for cycles, but for millennia. Yet the most unnerving realization came from the lack of traditional interstellar defenses. The Terran sphere was ringed not by heavy cruisers, but by a delicate, nearly invisible lacework of interconnected kinetic energy dispersal nodes, a network that was completely dormant, yet carried the silent threat of absolute, precise reaction. They were not defending against a threat. They were maintaining a stable equilibrium, a self-contained environment so vast it felt less like a civilization and more like an entire, managed ecosystem. The Sojourner's beacon initiated the standard Ethel primary diplomatic hail, a complex sequence of mathematical primes and historical iconographic data meant to establish shared cosmic context. It took the Terrans 23 standard minutes to respond, a delay that felt deliberate, a silent statement of their own unhurried tempo. When the response finally came, it was not the torrent of chaotic, fearful, or belligerent communications Kryze had anticipated. It was a single, pure, highly focused transmission, devoid of noise or static, delivered on a narrowband quantum entanglement channel that indicated a level of communication technology far beyond the Tier 4 designation. The image resolved in the beacon's central monitor. It was a single Terran, a female, seated behind a minimalist console. Her appearance was unremarkable by Ethel standards, a species of soft, biological vulnerability, but her presence was immense. Her face was calm, utterly composed, lacking any visible trace of fear, curiosity, or political anxiety. Her eyes met Kryze's with an unnerving, steady intelligence. She wore no insignia of military rank, only the subtle, silver piping of a diplomatic envoy. She spoke in the Ethel's own base language, the translation perfect, though delivered with a slightly different cadence, a lack of the ritualistic flourishes that peppered Ethel discourse. "This is Ambassador Alara Vance of the Terran Hegemony. Your vessel designate. D. Sojourner's beacon has been identified, tracked, and its diplomatic intent acknowledged. The initial 23 minutes of delay were required to cross-reference your primacy protocol with our deep-time archaeological archives, and to calculate the optimal response cadence. We have identified your polity as the ethel concordance, and we have confirmed your claim of a 20,000 cycle lapse since your last presence in the Sol system. We are prepared to receive your primary statement regarding the purpose of your arrival and the silent presence of the accompanying, non-communicative vessels at the Uit boundary. Kryze felt a strange, cold knot of respect and apprehension tighten in his sensory organs. She had not only understood their archaic protocol, but had used their own historical term, 20,000 cycle lapse, and with quiet authority had immediately called out the presence of Xylan's cloaked fleet. She was not intimidated. She was informed, and she was in control of the conversation's parameters. He adopted the gravitas of a representative of an ancient power, carefully calibrating his tone to convey solemnity, not superiority. Ambassador Vance, I am Counselor Kryze, emissary of the Ethel High Council of Preservation. Your understanding of our history is both unexpected and welcome. The purpose of our arrival is solely one of retrieval, a reclamation of lost cultural and material assets designated as belonging to the Concordance. 20 millennia ago, a vessel of the Concordance, the Vesper, was lost within your ocean biome, a necessary casualty during a critical phase of an ancient security protocol. This vessel contains the primary chronographic cores, crucial historical data, and a cargo of materials known to us as the critical supplies, or the catalyst of unmaking, a substance of immense volatility that was deliberately left behind to power an ancient, forgotten system. Our return is dictated by a fundamental, ethical imperative to recover these items, particularly the catalyst, whose uncontrolled interaction with an emergent biosphere poses an unacceptable systemic risk to your world. Ambassador Vance inclined her head slightly, a gesture that was surprisingly respectful but utterly devoid of subservience. Her composure remained absolute. Counselor Kryze, your statement is noted, categorized, and confirmed against our internal records. There is no dispute regarding the historical ownership of the vessel Vesper or its contents. Furthermore, your description of the critical supplies, the matter which we internally designated as element 119 sigma, is accurate in its volatility, and its intended function within a large, dormant gravitational manipulation system near the asteroid belt. Our own deep-time archaeology, combined with geological analysis of the suboceanic kinetic energy signatures, allowed us to precisely reconstruct the final moments of the Vesper within the last Terran geological epoch. We have been expecting your return for approximately 300 standard Terran years. Based on the cyclical renewal patterns, we extrapolated from the Vesper's long-dormant navigational beacon signal. The statement was a psychological torpedo fired into the core of Kryze's diplomatic strategy. They had expected them. They had named the catalyst. They knew about the ancient system. His entire strategy, predicated on a slow reveal of ethel history and a careful explanation of the risk, was rendered obsolete in a single, calm sentence. He could feel the calculated shock rippling through the command deck of the beacon. This was not a primitive species. This was a species operating with an astonishing, deep-time awareness, an active comprehension of events 20,000 years in the past. Kryze allowed himself a moment of genuine, silent awe, an internal philosophical recalibration that spanned millennia. He then proceeded with the next, and most critical component of his mission, the assessment of risk and the establishment of ethical custodianship. Ambassador Vance, your capacity for deep-time extrapolation is remarkable. However, the volatility of the catalyst of unmaking cannot be overstated. Its containment requires highly specific inertial dampeners and a zero-point energy field that is, by our current ethel standards, extremely demanding. We are prepared to deploy our specialized recovery teams, who are equipped with the required technology, to ensure the safe retrieval of the catalyst from the wreck site, minimizing risk to your planetary biosphere. The ambassador offered a ghost of a smile, a slight tightening at the edges of her lips that conveyed profound, quiet confidence. Counselor Kryze, your caution is appreciated, but it is unnecessary. The risk to the Terran biosphere was calculated by our Planetary Hazard Assessment Council approximately 150 years ago. Your species, 20 millennia ago, abandoned a volatile, potentially apocalyptic element on a Devel. Oping planet believing it to be the only available failsafe. We, the inheritors of that world, did not merely stumble upon it. We located the catalyst, identified its chemical and kinetic properties, and precisely determined its interaction with the local temporal gravity field. The containment solution you describe, Inertial dampeners and a zero-point energy field is precisely what we implemented. However, we did not use external power. Approximately 100 cycles ago, the Terran hegemony completed and activated the Acheron containment facility, an infrastructure built beneath the wreck site. This facility utilizes the catalyst's own latent energy output to perpetually power its containment field, creating a self-sustaining, negative energy well that has brought the material to a state of absolute, zero-risk thermodynamic equilibrium. It is, to put it simply, completely safe and contained. We have been the effective, ethical custodians of your lost property for centuries. Therefore, the deployment of your recovery teams is not required. The catalyst is ready for transfer at a time and location of the hegemony's choosing. A physical, audible gasp escaped one of Kryze's subordinate Ethel. This was not merely an advanced civilization. This was a civilization that had taken the toxic leavings of an ancient, fearful polity and transformed it into a self-sustaining, ecological safety mechanism, a monument to their own foresight and ethical stewardship. They had not panicked. They had solved the Ethel's greatest historical disaster with quiet, patient ingenuity. The psychological impact of this reveal was immense. The Terrans were not merely worthy of dialogue, they were worthy of immense, profound respect. They had turned a volatile risk into a stable equilibrium, a reflection of their own internal political state. Kryze allowed the deep silence to stretch, a measure of respect for the sheer intellectual force of the revelation. He knew instinctively that this transmission was being relayed in real time to Marshal Xylan and the entire veiled vigil fleet at the Uit cloud. The Marshal's arguments for surgical force were now rendered hollow. You do not conquer a species that has quietly and efficiently managed your apocalyptic mess for 20 millennia. You negotiate with them humbly. Ambassador Vance, Kryze resumed, his voice softer, stripped of its former diplomatic pretense, conveying instead a genuine curiosity. Your civilization's capacity for foresight and ethical management is unprecedented. We came prepared for every contingency, from hostile engagement to diplomatic deadlock, yet we failed to account for a scenario of profound, ethical custodianship. I must now speak with the authority of the full Ethel Concordance, and with the silent consent of the fleet commander at the periphery. I seek formal entry to your orbital sphere, not with the intent of reclaiming property, but with the profound desire to understand the ethical and philosophical vector that enabled the Terran hegemony to achieve this unprecedented stability. We will approach the matter of the Vesper's hull and the catalyst's transfer as a partnership, one dictated by your terms of engagement and your safety protocols. Ambassador Vance's slight smile broadened infinitesimally, a silent acknowledgement of Kryze's submission to the new reality. That is the logical, ethical conclusion, Counselor Kryze. You are welcome. We have prepared an orbital dock for the Sojourner's beacon at the Katlar station, a forward operating base near your designated wreck site. As for the Vesper's hull, the second part of your mission, we have preserved it exactly as we found it. A historical monument, currently secured within a dry dock environment at a controlled geological stabilization site in the Pacific biome. We will transfer the catalyst of unmaking directly to your vessel upon arrival, and then the true discussion can begin. The discussion of why our two polities, separated by 20,000 years of cosmic silence and historical accident, are now meeting under the shadow of the forgotten. The transmission concluded, leaving Kryze and his crew in the silent, star-filled void, overwhelmed not by fear, but by the colossal, unexpected reality of human poise. The docking sequence at Katlar Station was another masterclass in Terran operational philosophy. The station itself was not a military fortress or a sprawling industrial complex. It was an elegantly simple, rotating torus of muted silver alloys, entirely dedicated to research, deep space observation, and historical analysis. The entire process was automated, guided by precise, low-energy tractor beams that handled the Ethel frigate with the delicate reverence of a museum curator handling an ancient artifact. Counselor Kryze, accompanied by two of his most trusted science diplomats, traversed the airlock, a shimmering curtain of plasma that felt ancient and advanced simultaneously, and stepped onto Terran ground for the first time in his life, feeling the faint, controlled artificial gravity. Ambassador Vance met them at the docking egress, flanked by only two security personnel whose casual, relaxed posture suggested absolute confidence in the station's security and their own preparedness. There were no ritualistic greetings, no long-winded introductions. She simply extended her hand, palm up, a Terran gesture of open, non-aggressive welcome that Kryze had only seen in the deep archives. Kryze reciprocated with a slight, formal lowering of his head. "Counselor Kryze," Vance began, her voice low, conversational, yet carrying the same undercurrent of composed authority. "The catalyst of unmaking is ready for immediate transfer. It is contained within a hegemony standard type alpha casing, which is designed to integrate seamlessly with the power matrices of your beacon, utilizing the residual energy of the catalyst for its own perpetual containment. We chose the orbital transfer to minimize any potential risk to the Terran surface environment, though, as I stated, the risk profile is currently 0. Kryze felt the need to acknowledge the depth of the Terran effort. "Ambassador, the sheer scope of the Acheron containment facility, a project undertaken purely out of an ethical imperative to manage a non-indigenous, apocalyptic element, is a feat that commands the immediate and unreserved respect of the Concordance. Our initial models of your species were profoundly flawed, rooted in arrogance and temporal distance. I must convey the formal gratitude of the Ethel Concordance for your stewardship." "Gratitude is acknowledged," Vance replied, leading them through a sterile, quiet corridor that hummed with efficient Loki power. "It was not a matter of choice, counselor, but of logical necessity. When a potential threat to a civilization's survival is identified, the only ethical and rational response is to neutralize the threat with the most comprehensive means available, regardless of the historical source of that threat. Your ancient accident became our modern responsibility. The true philosophical disparity between our polities is perhaps this: you saw a problem you could abandon. We saw a problem we must solve permanently." The blunt, non-judgmental analysis struck Kryze with the force of an ethical revelation. The Ethel, in their own deep history, had prioritized their survival over the fate of the nascent Terrans, relying on the primal classification as an ethical justification for abandonment. The Terrans, in turn, had simply accepted the inheritance of the danger and calmly, logically, solved it over centuries. The exchange continued as they moved toward the transfer hangar, a quiet, rich philosophical duel over the nature of galactic responsibility and technological maturity. Kryze pressed on the nature of their technological advancement, seeking the source of the jump. "Your level of technology, particularly the deep-time extrapolation models and the quantum entanglement communication, suggests a trajectory that contradicts the known physics barriers. Your rise was too fast, too efficient for a chaotic evolutionary model." Vance stopped before a massive, heavily shielded door. "The hegemony's technological maturity is a result of sustained, ethical focus, counselor. We did not spend our early centuries fighting wasteful, species-internal wars for resources. We solved the problem of resource scarcity, then the problem of internal conflict, through logical, societal restructuring based on principles of sustainable equilibrium. When we turned our focus to the stars, we did not seek raw kinetic power for conquest. We sought predictive models and communication fidelity. Our quantum entanglement system was perfected only after we had perfected social equilibrium. Technology, for us, is a tool for problem-solving, not a weapon for dominance. We are not a militarily powerful species in the traditional ethel sense, but we are a species of absolute, dedicated problem-solvers. The Vesper and the Catalyst served as our initial, accidental, and most profound test." The doors hissed open, revealing a vast, climate-controlled transfer bay. In the center, a large, silver-sheen cylindrical casing, the Type Alpha, rested on a zero-gravity cushion. And beside it, guarded by the same quiet, composed security staff, was the recovered hull of the Vesper. The sight of the Vesper brought Kryze to a momentary emotional halt. 20,000 years had stripped the hull of its advanced biofiber cladding, leaving only the dark, ancient skeleton of its core frame, but it was undeniably ethel. It was the physical manifestation of their forgotten past, the symbol of the schism and the subsequent long silence. "The hull," Vance stated, her voice respectful of the moment, "is largely intact, preserved by the suboceanic pressure and the Terran stabilization techniques. We have retrieved the primary chronographic core, and they are currently being maintained in our deep archive under the strictest isolation protocols, waiting for your verification. However, we did discover an anomaly, an internal component that the historical logs seem to have entirely omitted." This was the opening Kryze needed, a chance to regain some footing on the diplomatic table. An anomaly. The Vesper's records were notoriously incomplete, a result of the emergency shutdown protocol. Vance gestured to a large, clear console positioned near the hull. During the stabilization and initial internal scan, we found a highly sophisticated multi-frequency broadcast array, completely separate from the primary communication systems. It was inactive, powered down for 20 millennia, yet our systems detected a minimal, highly complex quantum data packet loop that had been repeating for the entirety of the time. We could not decrypt it, as the encryption keys were unique, but we were able to isolate the source. A secondary drive core hidden behind the primary engineering deck, one that appears to have been added to the ship only moments before its final descent into your atmosphere. Kryze's internal alarm surged. A hidden secondary core, a concealed broadcast array, this was not a simple accident. This was a deliberate action, a piece of political or technological subterfuge buried deep in their history. This was not in the Vesper Manifest. Marshal Xylan's intelligence on the matter will be non-existent. What did this secondary core contain? It contained a final message, Vance said, her eyes meeting his with an intense, unreadable gaze. A single, incredibly complex encryption file, clearly intended for your concordance, but only to be accessed upon the Vesper's recovery and the successful containment of the catalyst. We did not attempt to violate the encryption. Instead, we have prepared a data transfer conduit from the secondary core to your own main analysis systems. The message belongs to you, Counselor. It is the final legacy of the beings who sacrificed the Vesper. Kryze felt the weight of 20 millennia crash down upon him. He was no longer just recovering property. He was confronting a secret history that had been deliberately obscured by his own forebears. The Terrans had placed him at the precipice of an ancient, internal ethel schism, and they had done so with calm, ethical neutrality. "Ambassador," Kryze said, his voice now a mere whisper of its former projection. "We will transfer the catalyst immediately and then dedicate the beacon's full computational power to the decryption of this anomaly. I request a secured, private channel to the Vigil fleet. Marshal Xylan must be informed of this development. We are no longer operating under the assumptions of the High Council. We are operating under the weight of an entirely new, shared history." Vance nodded. "The channel is open, Counselor. We look forward to the subsequent discussion, one that we suspect will no longer be about lost property, but about the true reason the Vesper came to Sol 3. It is our firm belief that the ancient ethel did not choose Earth accidentally. They chose it because they foresaw, or somehow engineered, the rise of a species capable of ethical, long-term custodianship." The subsequent 2 cycles were spent in a tense, shared silence. Marshal Xylan, having received Kryze's summary of the Terran composure, their ethical stewardship of the catalyst, and the revelation of the hidden secondary core, had been politically defanged. His military option had been reduced from a surgical strike to a suicidal diplomatic faux pas. He held the Vigil fleet in absolute lockdown, his initial bluster replaced by a profound military uncertainty. Kryze, within the Sojourner's beacon, supervised the secure transfer of the catalyst, a process handled with clinical efficiency by Terran technicians, and then directed all ethel resources toward the decryption of the single, complex file from the Vesper's hidden core. The decryption, even with the beacon's advanced processing power, was painstaking, taking time measured in the deep cycle of ethel ritual. Kryze remained in constant, low-level contact with Ambassador Vance, the conversations drifting from logistics to philosophical musings on the nature of sentience, responsibility, and the concept of an evolutionary leap. Vance introduced the Terran concept of cognitive momentum, the idea that the species' exponential growth was not accidental, but a focused, unified response to the philosophical challenge of their own existence, a species that had decided cooperation was the ultimate efficiency, and foresight the ultimate security. This quiet explanation further dismantled Kryze's preconceptions of their inherent chaos. Finally, the decryption algorithm locked onto the final key. The single, complex file unlocked, and the message played instantly in the beacon's command center, transmitted across the secure quantum link to Vance's cons. Ole at the Katlar station, and relayed under maximum security to Marshal Xylan at the Uit boundary. The message was not a typical ethel data stream. It was a recorded, heavily processed holographic image of an ethel, one Kryze dimly recognized as the ancient seer engineer Ryle Varn, a figure of immense political and scientific weight from the Schism era, his form flickering with the residual energy of the long-dead core. Ryle Varn's voice, a distorted echo across 20,000 years, was heavy with the burden of prophecy and fear. "Hear me, inheritors of the Concordance. We of the Eos faction did not lose the Vesper, we sacrificed it. We did not abandon the catalyst of unmaking, we seeded it. The official record of the High Council is a necessary lie, a shield against the panic that would have engulfed the Concordance at that time. We were not fleeing an internal threat. We were preparing for an external, cosmological inevitability. Kryze leaned forward, his whole being focused on the ancient echo. Vance, on the other end of the link, remained utterly composed, merely observing the unfolding drama of ethel history. Ryle continued, "The catalyst is not merely fuel for a gravity array. It is the key to a long-forgotten universal defense system that predates even the First Age, the Star Eater's barrier. This system, buried deep within the orbital mechanics of the Sol system, was placed there by the true precursor civilizations as a bulwark against the cyclical phenomenon we call the cosmic recession, the slow, dark tide of entropy that moves through the intergalactic space, consuming coherent energy and eventually collapsing all complex stellar structures. Our science was rudimentary then. We thought we had 30 millennia before the recession's vanguard currents reached our established territories. We were wrong. Our final calculations showed the first major wave of the recession, the shadow veil, would arrive within 21 millennia, a temporal window too small for the Concordance to unify and implement the ancient defense. The revelation struck Kryze with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The conflict over a lost ship was rendered meaningless. They were facing not a diplomatic incident, but a cosmic death sentence. We knew we could not activate the barrier ourselves, Ryle echo concluded, his voice fading into static. The energy signature of the full Concordance fleet would have drawn the shadow veil to this system prematurely. So we enacted the ultimate contingency. We planted the catalyst, the key, in a location that would remain geologically stable under the assumption that a native sentience would eventually rise. We modified the local evolutionary vector, using a small, controlled, gravitational pulse to ensure the emergent species would be driven by necessity, by the need for sustained, logical problem-solving, rather than the drive for chaotic conquest. The catalyst was not a hazard we left behind. It was a test of ethical guardianship, a temporal trap. If the species that emerged was fearful, chaotic, and destructive, they would destroy the catalyst, and the planet would be lost, but the rest of the galaxy would have a temporary rep.